Hello and welcome to this demonstration of Eucrasia, my final project prototype. So in this video I'll be hoping to run a playthrough of the prototype, trying to keep editing down to a minimum so that you can see exactly how the prototype runs in game. Hopefully this will give you a good indication of the capabilities of the prototype as well as some of its limitations and areas where there can be improvement. And yeah, as I say, I'm going to try and keep editing down to a minimum, so please excuse any stuttering or anything from me. Also, there may be some frame rate drops, and this is probably due to the screen recording software running at the same time as prototype, and hopefully this won't affect things too much. It runs fairly smoothly on my end, but it may not come across that way, and hopefully it will. Anyway, so this is the starting area. So the player deliberately spawned in a starting area where their view of the game world is restricted. They are unable to explore the game world until they have collected the supplies and talked to the NPC. They spawn directly in front of the NPC's door with the prompt there for them to see, giving the player no doubt in their mind where they need to go and how they need to progress. So we're going to chat to the NPC here. So this NPC introduces us a little bit to the game world. He explains to us that the village is in lockdown, and through him we get our first taste of this village and the plague that is visiting it at the moment. So what I'm going to do while I'm choosing my dialogue options is I'm going to role play as a melancholic player, and I'm going to do some variations on melancholy, however stick generally to melancholy just to illustrate to you how it would look becoming dyscrasia, but getting dyscrasia towards that end of the scale. So we read the full responses here, and this one on the end here looks to be probably the most melancholy of them. Now do feel free to pause the video at any time if you want to read the dialogue in more detail. Hopefully I don't rush through it too fast, but I want to keep the pace slightly up. But if you want to read through, do feel free to pause and you can read through the text that way. So we'll click on this first option. And so we can see the NPC didn't really like this dialogue choice. And while it's not particularly noticeable, the dark vignette and visual effect has just creeped in a little bit. The player's melancholy stat will have been risen as well. So you get a little bit more exposition here, particularly that everyone has been locked in their homes. We get a little inclination into the personality of this character. Now, the character model was chosen to look a bit of an aggressive guy, a harsh guy, a stern guy, and we get that through his dialogue as well. And here we get our instructions to the player, directing them to pick up some supplies in a handcart. Here we get the first hint towards the enemies that prowl the world. So in the final game, we wouldn't see enemies until the inciting incident, which occurs at the end of this prototype. However, for the purposes of demonstration, they are introduced a little earlier than they otherwise would have been, just so we can see the spawn points and enemies in action in game. So it looks like this guy's done with us. He wants us to head off now. so we better leave him to it. If we were to knock on the door again, he tells us to go and get the supplies and be on our way. So this demonstrates the changing nature of the dialogues. Now, in the prototype, the subsequent dialogues are often quite basic and simple. However, this doesn't need to be the case in the final game. These can be expanded upon with full-blown conversations had after the initial one. So we're going to leave him now. He told us to go and get some supplies on a handcart, and this looks to be the supplies here behind us. We see a text hint telling us to pick up the supplies. Press E to do so. When we do so, we see they disappear, and we hear a little noise indicating we've picked them up. We can hold Q at any time to see how many supplies that we have in our inventory. And so when I pick up this third supply, we should see another one added to our inventory. And I'll pick up the final supply now. So picking up all the supplies and talking to the NPC has triggered the door to open. Now this first initial area provides an important part to the game. It makes sure we have the supplies needed to interact with the NPCs later on. It also introduces us to the dialogue system in a simplistic way, ensuring the player isn't overwhelmed with new systems too quickly. Furthermore, the initial dialogue we choose sets the player immediately as being excuse me, sets the player as being aligned with a specific humour from the very start. And this is really important because this humoral alignment will inform enemy spawns, and it will also inform some of the dialogues the other NPCs have. While it's okay for the player to be a neutral alignment, the themes of the game encourage the player to seek balance. And so if the player is balanced at the beginning of the game, this detracts from this theme. Therefore, by locking the player in this area and forcing them to have this conversation, we force them to be unbalanced at the very beginning, setting them on a path where they must eventually regain that balance. So here we can see the player coming into the game world. The forest of this game world is densely populated with trees, each individually placed by myself. I was going to use the tree painter in Unity's terrain tools. However, it is incompatible with trees with more than one level of detail, and in order to get the performance required for this project, I required those trees to have multiple levels of detail. Otherwise, we'd go straight from high poly close-ups such as this one to the distant billboards that you can see right in the distance there. And I don't think this would have been a good final effect. I did use the tool, however, to paint the grass. Now, this allowed me to paint the grass incredibly thickly, which provides good results up close. However, it's rather labour intensive and so required draw distances for the grass to be reduced, and further efforts could be made into optimising this better so that there's less popping on the grass. So we can see the manor house up and above and the fort here below. It's isolated from the rest of the world with this promontory here, and this is important because as we round the corner, we are presented with our first view of the game world. The first view is of the church. This building is of key importance as it acts as a waypoint for the player, and they can use the church to gain their bearings if they find themselves lost in the game world. Many of the game world's features are designed in order to maintain a field of view to the church at all times. Wherever the player is, they should be able to see at least one of the major landmarks. The other landmark is in the distance there, the windmill. Also, it's also very clear to the viewer and is able to see it at other times. And of course the manor house, which is now hidden behind the ridge. These three buildings provide constant points of reference and allow the player to more confidently navigate the game world without having to use a mini-map or other such navigation aid. This allows for a more immersive and grounded game and generally helps the player feel more in touch with the game world they inhabit. Now, in order to justify this view, I've created a little logging camp which gives a little in-game justification as to why this area is deforested. The player is also greeted to a view of a forest path snaking through the forest on the other bank, and a little hut out there which in the final game would contain another NPC they can interact with, but in this prototype is empty. The river acts as a natural barrier to stop the player from exploring the game world immediately and forces them into the slightly more narrative-based exploration for the initial part of the game. The player is then able to explore more freely once they have navigated through this section. The player is also given the first view of the village, which was described to them by the NPC they just spoke to. This view is designed to give just a key outline of all the features: the bridge, the houses with the NPCs. Many of these houses are unoccupied, but in the final game these could be occupied by NPCs. Monetization options would also give the option to fill houses with further NPCs and DLC packs, further expanding upon the game story. The three key features of the map, however, remain the church, the windmill, and here round the corner, which we can just see through the trees there, the manor house. And I'll just get a better view for you of the manor house there. These represent the three most important aspects of the lives of the villagers: their faith, their food, and their lordship ruling on high above. So the player is forced down into this narrow road in order to reach the bridge. This gives an opportunity for us to see our first enemies. As we trigger the spawn, we see two melancholy appear, which have been spawned as the player was melancholy in his response to the NPC. There is also a choleric enemy spawned, which will give us an opportunity to heal up. So I'm going to kill these bears now. Now you can see as we took some damage from the melancholy, the choleric guy. Yeah. So as we took damage from melancholy, the choleric's flee AI activated, and he's trying to run away now. He went out of range there for a second, but what we can do is we can chase him down, try and corner him against this building perhaps. And we can see the post-processing effect lighten on the camera there. So that was a good opportunity for us to heal up a little bit after our little combat there, and is a key example of why the spawn pit system is important, that it spawns both enemies that are with your current alignment, and also there's the potential for enemies that are not in your current alignment, as they can heal you up. So as the player enters the plague village, we're greeted with a rather sinister view of abandoned houses. The iconic "Lord have mercy upon us" is painted on the doors along with the cross, and there's the disconcerting buzzing of flies coming from within. This leaves a lot to the imagination of the player as to what's causing that. the general sound design of the area is one of abandonment, and is generally designed to give an eerie sense that not all is well in this place. Now, we have two ways we can go here. The most obvious is to follow the directions of the NPC we talked to earlier and cross the river over into the part of the village which still has people alive. However, we could also try and see where this gate leads to, and I think that's what we're going to do. Just wander on down here and have a little explore. And the player would be faced with many opportunities to explore like this, sometimes leading them to secret treasure and sometimes leading them into an ambush. And now we can begin to hear that there may be some stirrings of enemies in this area. It looks like we may have in fact walked into an ambush here instead of anything good. Turning round confirms this as we see two melancholy and a collar. The collar is not aggressive, but the two melancholy are. So we're going to dispatch these two guys. We use the block here as well, as I've been dodging mainly the attacks. And the block gives that advantage of not making us any more melancholic, which could be quite a good thing if we seek to balance our humours. We can see again how the landscape is shaped to draw the eye to key features. Along this road we see the church on its promontory, clear and central. So we're going to chase down this collar now. There we go. That gave us a little bit of helium. Quite useful to keep us nice and healthy for the initial dialogues. And so we return to the creepy, deserted sound of the village. So here we can cross the river. The river acts as a natural barrier that is impassable to the player, forcing us through the paved village as described before. So this is the half of the village which the NPC said had people. However, most houses are still abandoned, and there would be a bit more life in the village in the final game, as described before. But we can see the general trappings of life dotted around, and people's goods are dotted across the landscape, populating it. And here we come to the village square. And this is the part of the prototype which has the majority of our NPCs. We were given 4 supplies as visible here, and there appear to be 4 houses. So it looks like we're to deliver the supplies and give them 1 each. Before we do that though, I just want to take us up on a little walk up to the church so that we can see the sights and get a better view of the game world as a whole. So as you can see, as we're exploring up here, the manor house is clearly visible, along with the windmill and of course the churches as well. All these sight lines have been carefully constructed to ensure the player constantly can refer to these 3 landmarks as points of reference while exploring the game world. This little bit of flavor text gives a little indication of something not being quite right with the game world. And this is of course building on the fact that the humours have come back or come into reality to haunt us. And tucked behind the church is a hidden secret of the horrors that is associated with the Great Plague, a plague pit, freshly buried dead from the village. And the sound of flies buzzing around. So from here we get a great view of the game world. On a lighter note, the main village, the bridge, the plague village, and the road leading off into the distance. These areas are available to explore. However, of course, the further we go from the main area, the less populated it currently is. If we explore down this path, we are led to the hut that we saw from the opposite bank, and there seems to be a skull on a stick, a grim warning that perhaps the inhabitant of this hut doesn't like to be disturbed. So in the final project, this hut would be inhabited by an outcast of the village, a sort of witch character who is the antithesis of the priest, but actually is a good person overall. And again, we can see from this position clear sight lines to the church, a little bit of the village visible, and the manor house also visible. Just over the hill we can see the turning blades of the windmill. However, the main sight lines are designed to show us the 2 points of the manor house and the church. This is a little portion of the game world that would be expanded upon in the final game, with more abandoned wooded areas to explore, with little secret places such as this hut dotted around. So we're going to run ourselves back now. We're going to sprint. Holding shift allows us to sprint. We'll loop our way along the little forest path. It gives a general idea of some of the exploration that can be done by the player. And this leads us back round to the village square. We can see also up here there is another path that leads us to the windmill. We'll have a quick little wander over there just to see the view, and of course, as this is a prototype, the distant view is not too populated. I want to keep the population of trees and things down to a minimum at this stage, simply because of performance and also time constraints. Placing each tree individually is quite time consuming, as you can imagine, and so I wanted to focus on the main areas. However, once again, sight lines are always considered. The church is visible from the windmill, poking over the trees there, and we have a brilliant unobstructed view of the manor house. So wherever we are, we can always rely on one of these three structures to guide us back home. So what we'll do now is we'll run ourselves back. You can see here all the thick grass really adds to the aesthetic of the game world. We'll run ourselves back to the main square, and we'll have a little chat with some of the villagers. So when we pass this, we might have heard some flies. That's not sounding good from here. So no, it appears that one of the villagers has succumbed. However, their death means that we have one extra resource to give out to the NPCs. Now we must decide who gets the additional one. Let's talk to this fellow first. So we've talked to the priest, and the priest doesn't appear to be doing too well. Now, as I said before, we're role-playing as a melancholy player, and so we're probably going to go for one of these two options here. I'm going to go for this one. And the screen darkened, which means that this was probably a negatively aligned comment, but sometimes it's not all too clear. And that comment was an example of when the player's intuition has to come into effect and they have to guess as to which comment is aligned with which. And some are much more obvious, but in that case it was quite a subtle one. Didn't seem to have responded too well though. So it looks like he's quite desperate for supplies and he's asking for additional ones. Now we could just give him the extra one we know we have, or we could perhaps get angry, or maybe look for a bribe. But in this case, I think we're going to try and reason with him and see if we can persuade him into seeing the bigger picture here. So he suspects that someone may have died, and in this case he's right. But there are a lot of people in the village. We could try and consider it, or maybe try and argue him round. While a melancholy player probably would go for this one, we're going to do this one and see what happens. The darkening of the screen shows us that it wasn't positively aligned, however we're not quite sure which it was at the moment. So this insightfulness suggests perhaps pituitary, as the melancholic probably wouldn't be able to argue this succinctly. Now, it's worth remembering that in the final game, these dialogue options would be timed, and so if this were the melancholic option, and this were a pituitary option, a phlegmatic option, and the player is currently melancholy, this would eventually be selected automatically. However, as this is demo build, I didn't include that feature so that I could talk through these features with you. So we're going to go for this one. So yeah, I think it was pituitary. As we can see, the vignette around the camera is really quite strong now. So it looks like we'll be able to come back to the priest. So let's go see how the others are doing. But we're going to really have to consider what dialogue options we choose, because our health is getting quite low. Now this is too clearly a melancholy option. We're going to have to select that if we're going to be role-playing. Yep, definitely melancholy, but the screen has become very dark now. Our next choice will need to be much careful. So we can see here the doctor wishes to get out. Now, these look to be a good option for us to gain some health back, so we're probably not going to go for this one here. That looks like a melancholy one. We're going to need to change our tune. Let's go for this one. This one appears quite jovial. Yeah, it looks like we might have healed ourselves a little bit, but probably not enough just yet. So the doctor's quite keen to get out and about, and this reflects the desires of many of us during lockdown. Many of us felt agitated, unable to do our jobs, stuck at home, and a lot of the dialogue will reflect this in-game. This really helps the player to build a sense of empathy with the characters because they've experienced this themselves. Admittedly, with a different timing, a different setting, a different time period. However, there is definitely a shared experience there. So here we can see that as the doctor is unable to go out and work, he diagnoses us instead and correctly diagnoses us as being melancholy. Now this dialogue here will change regarding depending on the player's current humoral alignment. If the player were choleric, he would comment on the player being choleric, etc. So let's continue on from here. This gives the player an explanation of the key features of the game. And if you want to pause and have a read through these, do go ahead. But they are explained in other videos as well. Again, these comments all give important exposition to the player, they're really explaining the balance system in the game, and going on to explain the enemy types as well. Now we can go in here and discuss the humours, and as you can see, this balanced our humour slightly. When we first ask him about the humours, it just gives us a little boost, designed to be encouraging the player to ask questions like this. So we can go in a loop from here and ask him as many times as we want. We won't get that bonus again though. And I'll just cycle through these so you can view them all. So let's move on to the supplies. So he is looking for extra supplies as well, and it doesn't look like we'll be given the opportunity to come back to him as he needs them now. We're going to have to just give him supplies and hope that we wouldn't have benefited better from giving him more. Yeah, he didn't like that. We may not have impressed the doctor too much, but there's still other NPCs that we can impress. We can see already that our health has improved greatly, so not all is lost. So this character's quite keen to get out of the house, and I'm sure we can all appreciate that feeling. And once again, I'm going to try and balance our humours by going for more optimistic options. But she didn't seem to like that. Now each NPC would have their own preferences, and it's all about getting to know the NPCs and what their likes and dislikes are. In this case, she doesn't seem to be too much of a fan of blind optimism. Perhaps a more realist approach would be better. So she's asking where the other watchmen are. Let's be a realist. Let's say the truth and we don't know. Well, she seemed to respond a little better to that. And again, reflecting how we felt during lockdown, we were constantly looking for news and trying to be updated on what was going on in the world. Now we're quite fortunate in having access to the internet and news channels. In the 17th century that was not the case. And so a lot of NPCs will see you as their sole source of information. And that's reflected in the dialogue. So let's try for the realist but kindly approach that she seemed to like. And it seems to have worked again. However, we can see from the slightly darkening screen that may not have been the best decision for us to make personally. Let's give her her supplies, as she doesn't seem to ask for any extra despite having her kids. So at the end of the dialogue there, unfortunately it showed one of the bugs that is prevalent with the dialogue system, where sometimes dialogue options would not spawn. And this is a problem to do with Unity's parent-child structure, where sometimes if the parent-child structure becomes too complicated, Unity fails to load the objects. And it's an unfortunate limitation of Unity, which I was not aware of until quite late into the process and too late to really fix it. Now, this is a unfortunate state of affairs, as it has hampered the dialogue system considerably. However, the system itself, when it does work, works quite well, and so I still feel like it's a worthy contribution to this prototype. We can check our supplies now, and we still have 2, so why don't we just give the priest those extra supplies he was hoping for. So giving him the supplies seems to have triggered something, and we've been swarmed by melancholy. It looks like our demons have come to haunt us. Try our best to kill these melancholy. And so we see the death screen, which is viewed by all players upon death. Now I'm going to restart the prototype here. So here we are in the restarted prototype, and the level has reset, and we could continue to have our conversation with the NPC as we did in the beginning of the prototype. As you can see, we're back to having 0 supplies, and the supplies are back on the cart, so it's restarted completely. Now, the swamping of the player character with NPCs marks the end of this prototype. Whereas in the final game, this would mark our first interaction with the enemy types. The player would be swarmed by their dominant humour and killed. However, they would wake up somewhere in the woods sometime later. And it's a key part of the storyline and our first interaction with the enemies. And we would then return to the village and be tasked with finding out what is it that happened, what those enemies were, why are they here, and what happened to the men who came before you. However, that is beyond the scope of this prototype, and this marks the end of the experience. So I hope you've enjoyed watching it, and thank you for watching, and thank you for listening to me.